Today on Uncommon Knowledge, Christopher Hitchens, Meet.
Funding for this program is provided by the John M. Olin Foundation.
Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Our show today, a conversation. Christopher Hitchens, for decades a dedicated leftist and a contributor to the left-wing journal The Nation. Hitchens broke with the magazine in a very public dispute over the war in Iraq, and he is now a firm supporter of conservative President George W. Bush's foreign policy. During the war on terror, Hitchens has reported extensively from Afghanistan, Iran, and Iraq. Some of his reporting is collected in his newest book, Love, Poverty, and War. Today, then, the evolution of Christopher Hitchens. American Heritage Dictionary, Trotskyist, a radical who adheres to the theories of communism advocated by Leon Trotsky, usually including the principle of worldwide revolution, neoconservative, a member of the political movement in favor of political, economic, and social conservatism that arose in opposition to the liberalism of the 1960s. Christopher Hitchens, a radical in your youth, have you now joined the conservative reaction against the values of the 1960s that you yourself once celebrated?
Someone asked me the other day if I'd become a neocon, and I thought, well, I don't consider myself any kind of a conservative, and I think that the problem may be originally in the definition. It was Michael Harrington, who was a famous American socialist, invented the term neocon, I believe.
Did he? That I wasn't aware of.
To describe those of his former Trotskyist friends, such as Irving Kristol, who had evolved out of socialism altogether and towards a kind of market-based anti-communist liberalism, sometimes inflected by the writing of Leo Strauss. There are several Trotskyists who've made that transition.
Right.
Well, if you look at what the neoconservatives have been doing and saying in the last couple of years, you'd have to say they were the most radical faction in American politics, it seems to me.
On account of?
I mean, I've lived to see not just some of the triumphs of the 60s undergo diminishing returns, but I've lived to see people on the supposed left say, but if we removed Saddam Hussein, it would destabilize the Middle East. Now, whatever you want to call that position, you can't call it a radical one. Right. You'd have to call that a conservative, or actually I would characterize it as a reactionary position. People who will take the bet on revolution and democracy and on the release of repressed political forces are not conservatives. Not by any definition known to me.
You in the 60s versus you today again. I want to, let me quote you to yourself. I attended many rallies in favor of the victory of the Viet Cong. We on the left, objected to Washington's imperialist war. All right. Why should you oppose totalitarianism in the Middle East, which is what you call one of the words you've used for the Islamist approach in the Middle East? Why would you oppose totalitarianism in the Middle East, but support the totalitarian intentions of the Viet Cong toward the South Vietnamese? Why should you have considered American involvement in Vietnam imperialist when you consider the American involvement in Iraq liberationist?
Well, that's easy.
Okay. Happy to hear it.
Well, for one thing, the Viet Cong in many ways were the South Vietnamese. I mean, there is no doubt in my mind now, and there wasn't then, that the revolution in South Vietnam was part of an all-Vietnamese revolution. I don't think there were ever two states in Vietnam. It was an artificial partition imposed by the superpowers. So this is the Vietnamese revolution, among other things, cut with the grain, first of reunification of the country,
right,
and second of the expulsion of foreign colonial forces. It was the continuation of a struggle that began.
But the problem is there were also quite a few Vietnamese who got expelled as well. How do you handle the both people in that argument?
Well, I believe myself that if Vietnam had not been subjected to a quarter of a century of imperialist war, that there wouldn't have been a large amount of this terrible suffering in Vietnam.
So your argument then is that the
But I will say, you still force me to say, and I will say,
go ahead,
with great reluctance, but so as not to seem to be avoiding your question, that the terrible though the sufferings of the boat people were, and I've been in Vietnam and talked to many of them, many of whom have come back by now. It's nothing to the near destruction of the whole ecology and society Vietnam, the planned destruction of it by American imperialism that occurred
Now, wait a minute.
in the 1960s.
All right, so that's the second part
That
of
was
the
a,
question.
that was
Why
a
is
very
that,
serious war crime and a very serious political crime too.
why is that imperialism?
Well, because it's the direct descendant of the French colonial enterprise. I mean, the American invasion actually of Vietnam is designed to rescue the French position, which is a disgraceful and indefensible after it's already been proven wrong at Dien Bien Phu.
Roosevelt leans on Churchill. Part of the reason that they are cold toward each other, or much less warm than they were originally by the end of the Second World War, is that Roosevelt will have nothing to do with colonialism.
How right you are.
Eisenhower refuses to permit the Suez invasion to go forward. And by the time it comes to Vietnam, they're not trying to prop up any imperialist French colonialist venture. They're trying to stop the communists in China and the Soviet Union.
The only thing you say there that's right is that Roosevelt was very much opposed, not just to colonialism in general, but very opposed to French colonialism in Indochina. It's fascinating to speculate what might have happened if Roosevelt had been around for the post-war settlement. But the facts cannot be other than what they are. The United States offered at one point to use nuclear weapons to defend the French position in Vietnam. It was paying for the cost of the French war until the shattering defeat at Dien Bien Phu, from which it did not learn, and it then took over the French colonial role, including the imperialist partition of the country. It was an operation that deserved to be defeated.
Here we now, Christopher Hitchens on the axis of evil, beginning with North Korea. As far as I know, you're the only journalist who in recent years has traveled to all three members of George W. Bush's axis of evil: North Korea, Iraq, and Iran, and I'd like to talk about each. North Korea, when were you last there, and how did you get in the first place?
Well, you can't get into North Korea as a journalist, so I went under my other professional capacity of being a university lecturer. I got the New School to write a letter. It was kosher too. I mean, I wasn't faking an identity, but I was concealing the fact that I was a reporter. And you'd have to go on an organized trip.
What year was this?
This was just before the election of President Bush, actually.
So it was 99 or late 2000?
Yeah, it was. Clinton was hoping to go to North Korea before his term was up, but he'd messed things up so badly by then he didn't have time. Madeleine Albright arrived a week after I had left.
I see.
And that was, I think, the last trip she made. And so we're talking about the cusp of the of the millennium, among other things. And
you're right, of North Korea. It is exactly as if it was modeled on 1984, Orwell's novel. The leader worship, the terror, the uniformity, the misery, the squalor. All true. Still?
Yes, it was. The state was founded, actually, I think the year that 1984 was published. And it's as if they sort of took the book and thought, I wonder if we could make this work.
Right, right.
You know, one tries to avoid cliche. I remember I went to Prague during the old days, the bad old days of the communist regime, to attend a dissident meeting. I thought, whatever happens to me, I'm not going to mention the name Kafka in what I write. I'm going to be the first reporter who goes to Prague and doesn't bring up Kafka.
Does not say Kafka.
And the policeman came in, the secret police broke into the meeting I was at and slammed me up against the wall and said, "You're under arrest." And I said, "What for?" And they said, "We're not telling you what for." And I thought, damn, now I have to resort to cliche. I have to mention Kafka.
I have to say Kafka.
Well, if you go to North Korea determined not to mention Orwell or Orwellianism or 1984, you will, I'm sorry, you'll be forced to. They make you do it.
Clinton administration engaged in bilateral negotiations with North Korea and brought the nuclear program to a halt. The Bush administration has refused bilateral negotiations, with the result that every informed expert of whom I'm aware says that North Korea now has 2, 3, 4, some low number, but they have nuclear weapons. Who was better, Clinton or Bush?
Well, I think your two questions pull apart on each other.
You may rewrite the question.
If they do have nuclear weapons now, with the capacity to make them, which I have no reason to doubt, then that program can't ever have been brought to a halt, can it?
Well, no, as I understand it,
I think the halt was illusory. I think it was a feint. The North Koreans have never abandoned the ambition.
they put things up on they were pretty close under Clinton, but they did set things up on the shelf. And under Bush, they brought them back down.
That for them is a mere tactic.
What I'm probing at here is, has Bush messed this one up?
Well, we don't know yet whether his strategy of working with China is going to be a success or not. I mean, objectively, it could work for this reason. If the North Koreans go on in this manner, you remember the way they tested their first missile was to fire it across Japan without warning.
Yes, right.
Japanese think, Christ, there's a missile on the other side of us. Now from North Korea, bang. if the North Koreans go on in this way, Japan, which can make a nuclear weapon in no time, will do so. It is not in the interests of China that Japan becomes a nuclear power. And they must understand that the North Koreans are forcing this contingency upon them. So it seems to me there's a reasonable chance of triangulating the diplomacy in the region.
But you don't feel you're not willing to protest outside the White House and say, look, you must do something. You're quite content
Well,
to
no,
let
where I think we should be protesting is this. North Korea is a slave state. Its people are state property, and they used to be fed in return for being slaves. Now they're starved in return for being slaves. This is intolerable. We should be helping to open an underground railway for these slaves into China and forcing the Chinese to take these refugees and then allow them to transit to South Korea. They don't have, well, the Chinese have to take them
So
all.
we should be pushing much harder on humanitarian grounds.
We certainly should, and making it.
Next, Christopher Hitchens justifies the war in Iraq.
Katha Pollitt, your former colleague at The Nation, quote, talking about you, you set up the equation so that there is no way to oppose invading Iraq except to be a coward or a covert admirer of dictatorship and theocracy. Well, I don't think it's cowardly to be extremely wary of war, especially preemptive war, close quote. Now, no matter how well things may seem to be going in Iraq after the election of January 31st, the war was optional. The war was optional, and nobody ought to engage in a war when he has other choices, correct?
No, false.
All right.
I wrote a short book about Iraq,
the title of
which is The Long Short War, the postponed liberation of Iraq. I could have called it the Short Long War, but I thought the Long Short was better. Been at war with Saddam Hussein since the day that he crossed the border of Kuwait. Not to invade it, remember, or even to occupy it, but to annex it, to make it cease to exist. Yes. An unprecedented level of aggression, destruction of a member state of the United Nations, not invasion of it.
Right.
A member of the Arab League and of the Islamic countries, the province of Iran.
Right. Iraq.
The province of Iran.
Right.
His withdrawal from there was negotiated under various conditions, that not all of which he agreed to meet. So he had to be monitored by international sanctions, which meant that Iraq had lost its sovereignty, and enforced by no-fly zones, which meant that 2/3 of his airspace no longer belonged to him, and he fired at those coalition planes every day for 10 years. So we were in a state of armed truce at the very best.
Right.
At some point, someone was going to make a decisive move to end this state of suspended animation. On past form, we would have left it to Saddam to decide what the next crisis was going to be. We always had.
Right.
I thought it was time to say, no, we'll end it, and this time it'll be on our terms. You will find out when it's in. We're not going to wait for you to take the initiative. But that's not preemption.
Did the Bush administration make a mistake in using that word preemptive? Bush, in one State of the Union or the other, used the word preemptive. They used that several times, and everybody laughed. Was that an error?
Yes, because it was an attempt to make the analogy with Afghanistan.
Now, what about the talk about weapons of mass destruction? Was that also an error? That is to say, you've just laid out an argument. I myself consider it not only plausible but compelling. In fact, I consider it decisive. However, the Bush administration did not make quite that same argument. They could have, but they didn't. Was that just ham-fistedness?
Mr. Bush and Mr. Blair, I'm sorry to say, both decided that it was a little easier to frighten people than to persuade them. This is a common political temptation. What I just described to you would make it possible to define Saddam Hussein as a permanent threat, it seemed to me.
Yes.
Because he had done the four things that mean that a country can lose its sovereignty and be invaded. Invade other countries,
right?
Persia, Iran, Kuwait. Commit genocide, in this case in Kurdistan.
Right.
Fool around with weapons of mass destruction, which he used on his own soil. I will not say on his own people, because they were not his own people. That's all the same. Right. On his own soil and in Iran, and harbor international terrorists. Now, he'd done all of these four things and was addicted to all four activities, as a matter of fact. Amazing, really extraordinary. He was not, as Mr. Pollitt said, that we picked a fight with him, but that we allowed this to go on for so long.
Right. And had Blair and Bush simply relied on that?
Permanent threat, yes, but the imminent threat is scare tactics. Now,
but you're not willing to cut them a little bit of slack because they did have intelligence saying there are weapons of mass destruction.
Well, there were weapons of mass destruction. I'll go further than that. I mean, the common view now is that the hunt for weapons of mass destruction pulled up an empty net, did nothing of the kind. didn't find stockpiles on a shelf, but it found a very well-organized program for the making of nuclear and chemical and biological weapons, and for the concealment of that program.
As indeed the New York Times has in a rather ham-fisted way confirmed for us now.
And as is confirmed in a brilliant book by Saddam Hussein's chief nuclear physicist, Dr. Obeidi, who it wasn't just making claims of this kind, which someone who'd survived the regime might be expected to do, but was able to lead people to the elements of a nuclear centrifuge, buried in his own back garden under the orders of Qusay Hussein, whose job it was to run weapons concealment for the Ba'ath Party.
Now, you explain.
Christopher Hitchens has visited Iraq since the fall of Baghdad. Let me ask him what Iraqis think of Americans now.
Explain to me the psychological state on the ground, which I find so difficult to understand. The population did indeed hate Saddam Hussein. Nobody doubts that, correct? And the population, at the very minimum, is intensely resentful of Americans.
Yes.
True? Explain that conundrum.
The welcome that I've seen American and British forces get in parts of Iraq is something I want to mention first, because there are people who say that never happened. It's commonly said by political philosophers like Maureen Dowd, say, that where were the sweets and where were the flowers? Well, I saw it happen with my own eyes, and no one's going to tell me that I didn't. I saw it months after the invasion, people still lining the roads, especially in the south.
In the south?
Especially in the south.
Right.
Still lining the roads and waving, and the children waving, which is always the sign, because if the parents don't want them to, they don't.
Right.
For miles, it was the nearest I'll get to taking part in the liberation of a country and arriving with a liberating army. I'll never forget, and I will not allow it not to be said that did not happen. And in the marshes too, the Marsh Arab area of the country, which was drained and burned out, poisoned by Saddam Hussein. Again, almost hysterical welcome. And in Kurdistan, in the north. So extraordinary. But remember, you said the population hated Saddam Hussein. That's true, really true. But more than anything, they feared him. They were terrified of him. These are people who were not just forced to obey under terrible and believable threat, but made to applaud, made to participate, made to come out and vote, made to come out and demonstrate that they loved him. Right. Made to applaud when their relatives were executed. You know, if your kids were going to be shot, you had to attend and you had to applaud. Okay, a pornographic regime, in other words. Now, people who've been through that are humiliated. Okay, they're disgusted with themselves and depraved to some extent. Well, when they get a chance to show their courage, they very often will, even if it takes a somewhat ignoble form.
Right. Right.
So now that Mr. Muqtada Sadr, for example, who was as quiet as a mouse when there was real. Now he knows there isn't going to be a reprisal. Right. He can throw a bit of a chest.
Right. Okay. So in some sense, all this is healthy.
Yes, it's purging. Yeah, it's and as we saw in the elections, the way that people actually hung together and were developing now more of a sense of a communal solidarity.
I have heard Paul Wolfowitz say that one mistake that the United States made was that we didn't hold the elections a year earlier.
That's absolutely right.
Absolutely right.
Well, the despised Ahmed Chalabi, who's still a friend of mine and who I still admire, was arguing that at the time. Many a chance was missed to transfer sovereignty and to have an election. Well, nor will we get back the months that we wasted not doing that and behaving like occupiers instead.
But you're generally optimistic now about Iraq.
Well, it's been moved into the post-Saddam era, and it's helping helping neighboring countries to.
It's not going to fall. It's not going to break into three pieces.
This is the flag of Kurdistan in my lapel, but my Kurdish comrades say that their main responsibility is for the new Iraq now.
All right.
And they, who would have every right to say we want to get out of this prison house of a state, are willing to instead cooperate to help to emancipate the rest of it. I think that's an extraordinary sacrifice on their part. Deserves more recognition than it's had.
Third member of the Axis.
Finally, the last member of the Axis of Evil, Iran.
Like North Korea a year or two ago, Iran is embarked on a nuclear program. The Bush strategy let the Europeans negotiate with the Iranians while the Americans make threatening noises, a policy that, it could well be argued, has so far proven 100% ineffective. Sir?
How right that is. Let's remember, by the way, that the nuclear program in Iran was started by the Shah. The Bushehr reactor, for example, was built by him in megalomaniac days, and if he'd been a little faster, he might have been able to hand over an entire fully finished nuclear program to Ayatollah Khomeini. Remember, any state that goes nuclear, in a sense, makes its successors and sometimes its enemies nuclear powers as well, or runs at risk. So there are differences, however, I think. One is we had every reason to think if Saddam Hussein had a thermonuclear weapon, he'd have found an early occasion to use it.
Right.
Either use it or use it for blackmail.
Right.
I don't have that fear, actually, about the Iranians. There's no one they can go to war with. And incidentally, we've just done them the rather large favor of removing their two greatest enemies, the Taliban and the Iraqi Ba'ath Party.
Right.
They're not going to have a nuclear war with Israel because they would lose it.
Yes.
And furthermore, nuclear weapons aren't usable even by the most fanatical Islamists in Palestine because you'd have to blow up the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, as well as the Wailing Wall, and kill the Palestinians as well as the Jews, in other words. So the immediate danger isn't that terrifying. The problem is that one doesn't want to reward the cheating and concealment and theft and smuggling and black market acquisition, the open contempt for international law that's involved. But the regime might also give way in time to a successor regime that would be more internationalist and more democratic. That option was not going to occur naturally in Iraq, and it certainly isn't going to occur naturally in North Korea.
You've said that in North Korea, the Bush administration, the United States, ought to be pushing much harder on the humanitarian line.
Yes.
Now, my colleague at the Hoover Institution, Abbas Milani, himself an Iranian, who spent some time in the Shah's jails, points out or argues that the young people in Iran, and the population, well over half the population is 25 or younger, is immensely favorably disposed toward the United States. That what we ought to be doing is engaging in a kind of rhetorical comradeship with the democracy movement and waiting. That the principal job of the Bush administration is to show its friendship toward the young people of Iran and not mess it up. Do you agree?
I'm very much of your friend's opinion. I mean, I grew this beard on the advice of a graduate student of mine, an Iranian, who was my guide. He said, if you want to go to the Friday prayers and the Death to America events, you better look as scruffy as you can. So I did, and so did he, but and it seemed to work, but also it made life very difficult. Often taxis wouldn't stop for us because they thought we were Hezbollah. And relatives of his would say, you know, we went to dinner with them, can't you shave that off? You look like some Islamic Republic nightmare. You could get spat on. You know, it's the hatred for the regime among the young is a delightful thing to see, as is the friendship towards the United States. And I have a word for it.
Yes.
Well, it's the baby boomerang. You see, the mullahs threw away so many of their young people in a suicide wave war with Saddam Hussein, which people I think still remember. The throwing away of handfuls of the younger generation. You know, what turned into a pointless war. They had to give Iranian women incentives to
produce,
make up the deficit. Now there is a baby boom, but it's a baby boomerang because this younger generation despises the mullahs and the state that they run. Wants to live in America, if it can't do that, wants to live an American life. The regime, meanwhile, is becoming visibly senile. It's not reproducing itself, palpably senile. And so even the Revolutionary Guards are getting a bit long in the tooth.
So you're quite confident?
Well, give it 10 years, and yes, it will metamorphose into something like a secular Middle Eastern democracy. But the timeline of Hezbollah and of the nukes isn't a 10-year timeline.
So Bush
it would be very. If you were the President of the United States, you said, I think let's just relax about Iran for about 10 years. I can see people saying, well, Mr. President, do you want it later to be said that you ignored the building of a secret tunnel in Isfahan for the concealment? That would be a tough call.
So Bush he needs to make his threatening noises, and he needs not to mess it up. He's doing all right.
There's no settled policy, though, in the administration.
I
mean, in other words, they're doing this not as a policy, because they're doing it because they haven't got a policy, not because they have. So I can't praise it.
But it's not doing too much harm.
It doesn't make me want to go and demonstrate, no.
Thank you very much. One last,
the White House Gates test.
Final couple of questions. Describe the Arab world as you believe it will exist a decade from now. Alas, what I'm after here is the Wolfowitz vision, the Wolfowitz and Bush vision of democracy blossoming. Let me just ask you a couple of questions. Iraq will be a functioning democracy a decade from now?
There's every reason to think that it could be, yes.
Lebanon?
In some ways, Lebanon already is a functioning democracy.
And will there be a Palestinian state?
Yes, there certainly will be a Palestinian state. There should have been one 2 decades ago. There will be one a decade from now.
But that's in prospect.
Yes.
Good. Happy to hear it. Describe the reputation of George W. Bush a decade from now. Last question.
I'm going to a debate in England in a few weeks, sponsored by The Economist, where I was asked to come and take the side of the motion that said, "Thank God for George Bush." And I wrote and said, since I'll be at the same festival saying there's no God to thank, could we not rephrase the motion? And I said, I would prefer to have it said that history will be kinder, much kinder, to Mr. Bush and Mr. Blair than to Herr Schroeder or Mr. Chirac or Mr. Kofi Annan. And I think if I phrase it like that, I've answered your question.
You have indeed. Christopher Hitchens, thank you very much. I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge. Thanks for joining us.
We welcome your comments on this week's show. Our email address, comments@uncommonknowledge.tv. For more information about Uncommon Knowledge, please visit our website, www.uncommonknowledge.tv.
Funding for this program was provided by the John M. Olin Foundation.